Well, welcome back. Wednesday, January 29th, 2020. I should like to talk with you about the word farce and the several farces we now live under or just seem to have to abide. It runs from partisan politics to domestic to foreign policy. First, if I might, a distinction. President Trump is inclined to call the impeachment a hoax. I believe the better word is farce. Let's start with Merriam-Webster. They define a hoax as an act intended to trick or dupe. It derives from the old word hocus, as in hocus pocus, a trick. Farce is defined as an empty or patently ridiculous act, proceeding, or situation coming from the root of to stuff something, as in meat. But empty and patently ridiculous acts, proceedings, and situations, they are the world, I believe, we presently occupy. Let's start with impeachment. Thanks goes to Scott Johnson for pointing this tidbit out. Who knew, other than Alan Dershowitz, who, by the way, Jonah Goldberg claims was, and I quote, full of bat guano craziness. He might be a vector for the coronavirus, close quote. That's what he said of Alan Dershowitz's presentation Monday night. Let me give you that again. To Jonah Goldberg, Alan Dershowitz's presentation was full of bat guano craziness. It might just be a vector for the coronavirus, close quote. Talk about living in a different world than I do. Anyway, farce, impeachment, and Scott Johnson's close reading that seemingly only Alan Dershowitz picked up. First, there was an impeachment report that Jerry Nadler filed with the Senate. Few, evidently, side of Dershowitz, have read it. But as Scott and a Real Clear Politics reporter have found, the Judiciary Committee report helpfully provides a definition of what they're really trying to do. To quote Scott, in a section describing what the Democrats believe constitutes impeachable treason, the Democratic majority writes, quote, at the very heart of treason is deliberate betrayal of the nation and its security, close quote. Trump has been effectively impeached for treason by what they write, except that the drafters of the report recognize that inserting the word treason in the text might prove a tad controversial. Instead, they just heavily insinuate it and confirm that they are charging the president with treason only in supporting materials that few will ever read. Keep in mind, Trump was never charged with treason, but obstruction of Congress and abuse of power. But they work the word treason in the report because, as you know, that is what the Constitution says is the key justification for impeachment. As Scott and the Real Clear Politics reporter tell us, let's be clear what's going on here. The Democrats set forth a definition of treason in their lengthy impeachment report and then inserted the same definition into the final impeachment articles, except without using the actual word treason in the description of what constitutes abuse of power. This would seem like a rather significant development, but most of the media discussion has blithely glossed over it. This would be precisely why Alan Dershowitz said what he said, for he read the report, and what Jonah Goldberg claims is, again, bat guano craziness. It might just be a vector for the coronavirus. Here is the point on this Dershowitz was making. You can't make up a set of criteria and label them elements of an actual offense. He said Monday, quote, don't allow your subjective judgments to determine what is and is not an impeachable offense. Would any American today accept the legal system in which prosecutors could charge a citizen with abusive conduct? Can you imagine a crime, abusive conduct? Fortunately, we have a constitutional protection against a statute that either forbids or requires the doing of an act in terms so vague that men and women of common intelligence must necessarily guess at its meaning and differ as to its application. Very difficult to imagine criteria that fit this description of what the Supreme Court has said violates the first essentials of due process more closely than something called abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. Another constitutional rule of construction is that when words can be interpreted in an unconstitutionally vague manner or in a constitutionally precise manner, the latter must be chosen. Precision must be chosen. Dershowitz went on to say you are entitled to use that rule of interpretation as well in deciding whether or not obstruction of Congress or abuse of power can be defined as fitting within the criteria of high crimes and misdemeanors. For the Senate to remove a duly elected president on vague non-constitutional grounds such as abuse of power or obstruction of Congress would create a dangerous precedent. The idea of abuse of power and obstruction of Congress are so far from what the framers had in mind that they so clearly violate the Constitution and would place Congress above the law. Now, nor are these vague, open-ended, unconstitutional articles of impeachment that were charged here. They're not saved by the inclusion in these articles of somewhat more specific but still non-criminal types of conduct. The specifications are themselves vague, open-ended, and do not charge impeachable offenses. They include such accusations as compromising national security, abusing the power of the presidency, violating the oath of office. In any event, it's the actual charges that charge abuse of power and obstruction of justice, neither of which are in the Constitution. It's the actual articles on which you must all vote, not on the more specific list of means included in the text of the articles. An analogy to a criminal indictment might be helpful. If a defendant were accused of dishonesty, committing the crime of dishonesty, he said, it wouldn't matter that the indictment listed as well the means towards dishonesty, a variety of far more specific potential offenses. Dishonesty is simply not a crime. It's too broad a concept. It's not in the statutes. It's not a crime. The indictment would be dismissed because dishonesty is a sin and not a crime, even if the indictment included a long list of more specific acts of dishonesty. Nor can impeachment be based on a bunching together of unimpeachable sins, none of which standing alone meet constitutional criteria. Only if at least one constitutionally authorized offense is proven can the Senate then consider other conduct in deciding the discretionary issue of whether removal is warranted. In other words, your jurisdiction is based on commission of an impeachable offense. Once that jurisdictional element is satisfied, you have broad discretion to determine whether removal is warranted, and you consider a wide array of conduct, criminal and non-criminal. But you have no jurisdiction to remove unless there is at least one impeachable offense within the meaning of high crimes and misdemeanors. And the elements of treason are nowhere to be found in the president's actions, nor is treason charged as an impeachment article. To go back to what Alan Dershowitz was saying, they cite as an impeachable offense abuse of power, and under it, they allege various forms of treason. That's upside down. If they had treason, they should have charged treason. They didn't. They used treason as a definition for abuse of power because they knew they didn't have actual treason. What a farce. Let's look at another farce we live under, that we have journalism in any sense of the word that matches the definition of journalism, defined as the collection and dissemination of news. Is that what you get from, say, CNN, which stands for Cable News Network? Do you get anything like what the journalist's creed states, which is posted at the National Press Club? It reads, inter alia, quote, I believe that the journalism which succeeds best and best deserves success, fears God, and honors man, is stoutly independent, unmoved by pride of opinion or greed of power, constructive, tolerant but never careless, self-controlled, patient, always respectful of its readers, but always unafraid, quickly indignant at injustice, unswayed by the appeal of privilege or the clamor of the mob, seeking to give every man a chance. I get if journalists don't want to fear God, fine. That's between them and God. But what of honors man? What of stoutly independent, unmoved by pride of opinion, never careless, patient, respectful of its readers? Is that what you got from Don Lemon with his little circus of making fun of rural and southern voters? Today, he tried apologizing. He said, quote, ask anyone who knows me, they'll tell you I don't believe in belittling people, belittling anyone for who they are or for what they believe or from where they're from. During an interview on Saturday night, he continued, one of my guests said something that made me laugh. And while in the moment I found that joke humorous and I didn't catch everything that was said, just to make this perfectly clear, I was laughing at the joke and not at any group of people. I'm sorry, that's baloney. The joke was about groups of people, Southerners and rural voters. It's like laughing hysterically and uncontrollably, which is what he did, about a joke about blacks or Jewish people, and then simply saying I was laughing at the joke, not the diminution or discrimination or criticism of blacks or Jews. Oh, and of course, he heard what was being said and going on. Of course he did. Go back to the videotape. What a farce. Then we get to the Middle East. We put people who won't hold elections and persecute homosexuals while trafficking in claims of Holocaust denial on par with democratic countries that provide equality to all citizens. We find a people governed by a charter that states, quote, we reject any alternative to the full and complete liberation of Palestine from river to sea, close quote, and think peace and statehood can be achieved. If you are tired of the kind of countries Iraq's leaders, Syria's leaders, Libya's leaders, Sudan's leaders, and Iran's leaders provide to the world and operations of world peace, you must ask yourself why you would want another Libya, Syria, Iraq, Sudan, or Iran. What a farce. I'm Seth Leibsohn. We'll be right back. I'd like to take a moment to tell you about my friends at Guns Etc. They are true American patriots. They strongly support our president, and they have over 10,200 square feet of firearms and firearm accessories. Please take my advice and stop by their store, which is a symbol of American freedom, or visit them at gunsetcetera.com and have access to over $350 million in firearms merchandise.